Today, I'm going to talk about proofs for God's intelligence and why atheists will deny it. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. So this is a thing I've been asked sometimes, because it comes up occasionally when you will have an atheist who will hear the proof from contingency and necessity, or the proof from change, motion, more commonly called, and we'll say something to the effect of, okay, let's suppose that was true. Or sometimes I'll say even like, okay, maybe, but like, why do you ascribe intelligence to this? Why can't it, why isn't it just a sort of a stupid principle, unintelligent principle? Kind of like a law of physics, where the law of physics isn't a person. It doesn't have like will and intellect and so on. So why? Because when you end with this all men call God, St. Thomas's version of it ends the proof with this all men call God. So why is it you seem to be making a large leap here? Why is it you ascribe intelligence to that? Because there's nothing in the proof that says it has to be intelligent. And indeed, St. Thomas does a little bit later in the Summa Theologica describe why God must be intelligent. The really interesting thing, though, and this comes to the heart of the matter, he doesn't say very much about it, actually. It's not a very complicated proof. And the reason why is because he uses human intelligence as a starting point. That human intelligence essentially must have a source, and us being intelligent and having free will, which are spiritual things, this source must be God. That's not precisely the way he puts it. I'm kind of translating into modern versions that God is the, because he describes that God is the maximum of intelligence, because God is the maximum of all things from which all things get their existence. And so since we are intelligent, since we have will, God must therefore be intelligent and have will as well. And if you believe that human beings are intelligent and have will, and not that these are mere epiphenomena fooling us into thinking that we think, I'm sorry, I'm probably going to laugh during this because there's no way to describe this sort of materialist position without it being silly. But anyway, so if it's not an illusion that we think, that we actually are thinking things, that we have intellect that can grasp truth, that this is a spiritual thing, it's a faculty of our soul. I don't mean that like the brain is not involved. I'm not trying to give a Cartesian dualism idea, but rather that this is a property of the soul, and the soul is capable of thought and will, even if it's missing its body. And, also that there are, angels, which are pure intellect that don't have any sort of body and can think. So at the maximum of this must be God, and God is the maximum it's something of a scholastic term, but rather that God is the fullness of this from which everything else comes. Well, here's the problem with that, and that's a fine argument if you believe in human intellect and human will as a spiritual thing. If you believe in spirit, then there's really no problem here. And nobody who believes in spirit has any problem with this in practice. You will not find that. Modern atheists, though, deny spirit. The history of it is relevant. I'm going to be very brief here, but the history of it matters because what you had in the late 19th century, that is to say the 1800s, were materialists who held there is nothing but matter and its interactions. This became untenable in light of quantum mechanics, and it kind of turns out, if you look really closely, it's a little bit iffy if matter even exists at all. And what I mean by that is that matter was conceived of as this sort of solid thing, like atoms are just pool balls, like billiard balls, like on the pool table, that just bounce around, but in 3 dimensions. That they're these, little solid things that are completely solid and indivisible, and and they sort of just bounce around, and they're bouncing around and also sticking to each other. Describes everything. Well, that's obviously not true, and moreover, they're not solid. And depending on how, and this is just a model, bear in mind, but like a lot of the models are going in the direction of like, there really isn't a thing there precisely. It's more like a concentration in a field. And so you know, if you kind of translate these terms back into how people would have understood things in the late 1800s, you're kind of saying there is no matter, there's only spirit. It's not just the 1800s. This is a thing that was described in like, you know, the 1700s and the 1600s in philosophical circles as well, where people are just discussing like what is matter and so on, and what is spirit, etc. And the modern quantum mechanical definition of matter as concentrations in energy fields kind of comes out more like there is no such thing as matter and it's only spirit by those older terms. It's not that people particularly understood it that way, but the problem was you can't push this whole it's just matter and its interactions if you have these continuous extensive fields wherein there aren't really entirely discrete things from each other, completely and utterly separate from each other, that have like particular definitive deterministic locations. Because like once you can do the like electron wave experiment, if you're not familiar, if electrons like photons, if you hit them, if you have like the electron double slit experiment, I'm sorry, that if you have like two slits that's smaller essentially than the wavelength of the photon or the electron, you don't just get, and you have a wall behind the slits, you don't just get two spots, you know, when you fire electrons off, hitting in one place or hitting in the other. You get a wave interference pattern. And what's even worse is this happens even if you fire electrons off one at a time. They do not behave like solid things. An electron can somehow go through two slits and interfere with itself in a wave pattern, which, if you're thinking of it as like 3D billiards, makes zero sense whatsoever. And that's kind of what happened to materialism. And so the problem was, and here we're getting back to, we've sort of built the foundation to understand what we're talking about here, is that there isn't really a good way to reframe this in light of quantum mechanics. And the really sort of key thing, because the idea was, well, matter and its interactions explains everything, there's no need to have anything else. It's not provable. I mean, in itself, you can't prove this. There's no way to say, like, okay, I've seen a way that something could happen, so that explains absolutely everything. Because, like, where would your evidence be for that? You'd have to examine every single thing that happens, and you can't possibly do that. So it's an unprovable thing. It's purely an assumption. It gets even worse, though, in light of this. So, like, the sort of the key thing that they were after, really, at the end of the day, is really rejecting the idea of teleology. They wanted, the big thing was whatever it's made of, whatever all this is, the important thing is that composite entities don't exist, that there is no actual intelligence. Everything is just these sort of blind interactions that don't mean anything. That was really the key thing that they were after. They couldn't prove it back then. You can't prove it now. And you can't even really say it in a very sensible way, because if you're saying, like, okay, my hypothesis is that there's no intelligence and everything is just some blind interactions of who knows what, but something, right? It's got to be something, because clearly there's something. And the key thing is that all of it can be explained with assuming that there is no intelligence of any kind, but it's all just sort of like blind, trivial stuff that means nothing, and when it gets together doesn't mean anything. And there's no meaning to any of it. That's the key. Well, if you actually tried to phrase it that way, everyone's like, okay, you can assume that if you want to, I suppose, but like there's no reason to assume that, so why are you saying we should assume that? And the other problem is, like, you're kind of, it's not so much putting the cart before the horse, it's a cart with no horse, and you're kind of just making it obvious what you're trying to do, and your goal to say that life is meaningless and there's no intelligence and nothing means anything is, well, everyone, for the most part, except for, you know, sort of materialists like this, would look at that and go, no, life has meaning, and then, you know, argue over exactly what it is. But here's the thing. This is their goal. This is where they want to be, and they've gotten here in different ways that all amount to assuming without proof that it works. And they've more or less, the atheists who who used to be materialists. They sometimes call themselves naturalists now. Either way, the whole key thing, the entire thing that they want is that human beings and life in general are simply meaningless accidents that have no significance, that there is no thought, that there is no composite being, that at the end it's just a bunch of stuff that's happening with none of it actually meaning anything, without there being any sort of, well, for lack of a better term, logos to it. And so they are not going to grant you that starting point of like, well, we can think, we have a rational soul, and so, well, clearly that rational soul must then have, gotten its properties of being a rational soul from the Creator. Because what they're going to do is say, no. Thinking is merely the epiphenomenon of a bunch of whatever it is that's doing that, according to these blind, meaningless rules, and they just happen to produce this thing which happens to think that it thinks, or has gotten the idea that it has ideas, or mistakenly believes it's capable of making mistakes, except for that one, which it's capable of, except it's not, because there isn't a thing there, because it's not really doing this. There's just subatomic particles, well, or fields, or whatever it is. There's just that. Don't know what it is, but there's nothing more besides that thing where I don't know what it is. And but it's clearly not a soul, because where's your proof that it's a soul? So there, haha, got you. And go prove the soul to the Nobel Committee and you'll get your Nobel Prize, because like they award Nobel Prizes for things that have been common knowledge for millennia. Anyway, so yeah, exactly. So here we go. There's no intelligence, so you can't reason from that to God being intelligent, to the first cause, the primary mover, or an uncaused cause. Like, it's just a dumb principle that, like, Sierpinski's triangle, ignore the computer that it's running on, trivial laws, simple stuff, all dumb, no intelligence, therefore whatever else you could prove, no intelligence there either. And to some degree it's not really answerable. That's the unfortunate thing. Having spent a lot of time looking into this and talking to atheists, they're, at least atheists of this ilk, there'll be different kinds of atheists, but the sort of atheist who's a materialist slash naturalist slash physicalist slash whatever label you want to give to the unworkable version of this previously unworkable thing that was more believable in the 1800s. So, what do you do? And I'm not really sure that there is anything that you do. I don't know that this is something you can actually help people with. Like, I don't think there really is a way around it, unfortunately. And as I said, it's not a very good answer, but unfortunately, this is the answer that I've come to the conclusion of, and I've been asked this question, so here's the answer that the best answer that I've been able to find, is that if you're willing to do all the stuff I've described, where it started from and coming through, that's your endpoint. Like, if you're going to simply deny that reason exists, that reason, in the classical sense of reason, exists, that all reason consists of is, the ability to perform calculations that happen to be useful within an environment, and you can't extend outside of this environment, and they only, you only do them insofar as they happen to be useful. Basically, engineers. Like, you pay engineers to apply that sort of thing, and they give you iPhones. And that's about as far as it goes. Don't push it beyond that. And, well, if that's the position a person will take, and in my experience of talking to a lot of people, that is the position a lot of those atheists will take, there's nowhere to go. Like, you can't prove to someone that proof works. You can't reason somebody into reasoning. They have to make that leap themselves. They have to affirm that it is possible to actually truly know something, for the mind to grasp truth. And if they deny that there is a mind, if they deny that the mind can grasp truth, if you're talking to a person who will say, like, I don't think souls exist, we're just bodies that happen to do calculative things that happen to be useful, and we happen to, well, you can't really describe it, but like, think that we think. as I said, you keep coming back to that. Like, there's no good way of putting it. Like, we suffer from the illusion that we're capable of perceiving things, I guess, or something. Like, there isn't a good way of describing it. But anyway, that's kind of it. Like, there's nowhere to go. Like that's a person denying that reason works, because they're denying that reason exists. And so, if they're gonna do that, like, at that point, you're down to the thing, like you're not going to help them in any sort of intentional way. You're down to things like prayer and, witnessing by your life and your endurance and happiness in unfortunate circumstances and so on, and praying for them. Pray for everybody. This is just one of those cases where there isn't really much of anything besides prayer to do for them. So you can't pray and do things. You could kind of only do the praying part. Yeah, so I'm really sorry to say it. It's really unfortunate, but and any given person may not be completely gone, down that path. So, try. I remember someone I know who used to work. Used to be an engineer in submarines. Said, "What's the procedure for uncontrollable flooding?" Try to control it, because like either you're wrong and it is controllable, in which case you can control it, or like you're right, it's uncontrollable flooding, you won't control it, and the submarine's going to go down and you're going to die. So like, what's your alternative? Like would you rather die playing gin rummy, or like knitting a sweater than trying to control the flooding just in case you're wrong? So yeah, it's one of those things. Like, only conclude that someone's really, committed to that path, of pure unreason when you try, and it doesn't work. When you try to build off of reason and they just, will straight up reject reason. Yeah, so the one unfortunate thing I will say is, again, in my experience, they tend to, if this is an issue, if somebody raises this question, they probably don't actually believe in reason. They probably will object to you starting with a point of, well, we've got rational souls. Because, well, if they believed that we had rational souls, they probably wouldn't be asking the question. So, sorry I don't have a better answer. That's kind of where things stand, though. So, the one thing is, I can say that's possibly practical, other than, of course, pray for them. Which you should do for all people, whether or not there's other stuff you can do or not. But the one thing may be to like push them on that. That is to make it really clear that they're denying that reason actually works, that they're denying that it is possible to know truth, that they're saying that we are only capable of engineering insofar as we're capable of it. We happen to, by chance, be capable of making the things we can make, and so we do, and we call it reason. But it isn't. We don't really know things. None of this is actually the properties of the stuff that we're looking at. It just happens to be, a sort of useful fiction to us. Because, that's not a comfortable place to be. They tend not to really dwell in it. They just kind of want to be there when it suits them. And so sort of pushing them even when it doesn't suit them may be useful to get them to confront this sort of belief. One possible thing. Unfortunately, I've got nothing else besides that. So, yeah. Wish I had more, but that's at least sort of where it is. Hope that helps at least a little bit. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.